podcasts online as well. Tonight is our founding debates evening. Now, this is a very important program to me. It is the program that we started 10 years ago. This is the 10th anniversary annual founding debates, and we created it to honor the anniversary of the opening of the George Washington Presidential Library. My name is Doug Bradburn. I'm the president and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon. At that time, when we created this, I was the founding director of the George Washington Presidential Library, and we did this program in honor of Jim Reese, a longtime director of Mount Vernon, who was the great visionary of the modern Mount Vernon that you see around you. This hall we're in today was created because of his vision, as was the Presidential Library itself. That first debate, we talked about the state of the field of early American history. And on the panel, we had a number of young professors, brand new baby professors, none of which I think had really published a book. Their books were in production. And now they are, 10 years later, all of them tenured and very arrogant. They no longer come when I invite them to programs. That's what happens. But so we talked about the state of the field of early American history. And tonight we've got a bigger task. We're going to talk about the state of the nation. And we brought in some incredible thinkers and leaders who are out there thinking about this, working hard on this. It is the state of the nation, is the state of something that George Washington called the last great experiment in human happiness under civil society. The great experiment in self-governance. What is the state of the American Great Republic? What is the state of our national self-rule? What is the state of American democracy? Those are the questions we're going to put to us in this election year. And we're going to do it in a way that is nonpartisan. It's post-partisan. It's anti-partisan. It's something not partisan at all. But it is, the program is founding debates. And it's an opportunity to recognize that part of the success of this great experiment over coming on 250-odd years soon is this idea that we can deliberate maturely together in a cohesive way to rule ourselves. So how are we doing? Well, if you believe the wisdom of the American people, not so great. According to a Gallup poll from June 23rd of this year, Americans increasingly unconfident about our institutions. Only 28% of Americans have a great deal or quite a lot of deal of confidence in major U.S. institutions generally. The church, organized religion, the military, the U.S. Supreme Court, banks, public schools, newspapers, Congress, television news, organized labor, the presidency, the police, the medical system, the criminal justice system, and big business. Small business is doing okay. People think that's doing great. So we got that. We got small business. We can build on that. But seriously, the numbers are grim. 50% of Americans literally no confidence in the presidency. Only 9% of Americans have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in Congress. 60% have little or no confidence. 38% of Americans have little or no confidence in the U.S. Supreme Court. And even the military is at it's a low ebb of its approval. Now, this isn't terribly surprising. We've seen this, and it corresponds to an all-time crisis of confidence that relates to low levels of civic education and history understanding. We are not making the grade. 2020 report, National Assessment of Educational Progress, revealed that only 24% of eighth graders performed at or above proficient levels in civics and just 15% in U.S. history. 15% at proficiency levels in U.S. history. And yet we are a country that needs our citizens to be engaged, to understand why these institutions exist, to understand where they've come from, and the great achievements that Americans have made, the struggles they've made along the way to build these institutions that are ultimately fragile. Here again, we're not listening to the wisdom of George Washington. Quote, "In proportion as the structure of government is forced to public opinion, it is essential that public opinion should be enlightened." You're the public. You're here. You're not the problem, but you're going to get enlightened tonight. Now, the one other thing that Washington noted that I do want to get to is that this great experiment, he said, the preservation of our sacred fire of liberty is staked on this experiment, entrusted now to the hands of the American people. So we've been entrusted with this experiment. The American people out there in these polls are concerned. But the good news is what you're going to hear tonight. We're not going to stand idly by and let our country fall apart. We do this work every day, as many of the great institutions in this country do. 1 million visitors a year at Mount Vernon, 400,000 school kids a year. We're teaching. We're teaching about the founding. We're teaching the lessons of George Washington's leadership. We're teaching about the story of Mount Vernon and all the people who labored here, enslaved and free. And we do this because we understand it's a critical part of that mission to create an enlightened public that can make informed opinion. And that work is ongoing. And so tonight I'm going to bring in front of you some incredible leaders who are doing this work right now. So when you're at that cocktail party or that church chicken dinner and your neighbors are complaining about the state of the world, the state of the great experiment, you say, but we need to work at it. And I know people who are working at it because I heard about them at Mount Vernon. And what I'm going to introduce this audience to is a group called More Perfect. More Perfect is a coalition of leaders from across the country who are working hard on 5 critical goals in democracy. Universal civic learning, goal number 1. National service and volunteering, bridging divides, trusted elections, and more representative and responsive governance, and access to trusted news and information. And I think tonight you're going to hear about some of the work that has been ongoing in these critical areas, which are critical to the survival of our democracy. So, the first thing we're going to have is a quick talk by General Stanley McChrystal. And after that, we're going to have a panel discussion, which is going to be led by John Bridgen, who's one of the co-chairs of this More Perfect group. With this discussion, we're going to have Professor Daniel Allen, Del Anglin, Manu Meal, and Congressman Zach Wamp. And they're the ones who are going to have at these chairs. But this isn't just going to be a conversation amongst us. It's going to include everybody here, because we're going to have an opportunity for you to ask questions. On the back of your program is one of these QR codes that became so popular during COVID. So you all know how they work. But you can shoot there and you can type in your question, and that way we can get as many people participating in the conversation as possible. We'll leave it up to Bridge whether he can handle the technology. That'll be his first test. So we're going to kick it off with a bang with an extraordinary leader who walks in the footsteps of George Washington. As a great leader who's chosen to serve, who chose to put his life on the line for the ideals that Americans have held dear since the founding of the nation. Stanley McChrystal, retired 4-star general, former commander of the U.S. and International Security Assistance Forces. He's known for developing and implementing a comprehensive counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan. Since he's been out of the service, he has been a co-chair of More Perfect, the chair of Service Year Alliance, and of course the author of many books, including The Great Team of Teams, which all leaders should learn from. Let's all give him a big round welcome, General McChrystal.
I suspect, like most of you, I was raised on stories. And one of the stories that the military likes to tell about George Washington is at the end of the Revolution, the Continental Army was restive. They were up in Newburgh, and they didn't think that they were being rewarded as they should be. And they thought that the Continental Congress and the government as it existed at that point wasn't working. And there was a movement amongst some of them to try to get General Washington to accept a position that would have been unthinkable now, but potentially as an autocratic leader. The story goes he came into a meeting of them quietly, and as he stood up to talk, he pulled out of a pocket his spectacles. They'd never seen him wear them. And he said, "You'll have to forgive me, but I've grown half blind in the service of my country. I'm proof that comic books will do the same thing to your eyesight. But the reality is, we all grow up in the shadow of the idea of a George Washington. If there had not been one, we would need to create one. And the reality is we're in a pretty special place right now. The accounts I read, Mount Vernon was first built in 1734. George Washington didn't move here until 1759. And except for the periods extended in nature when he was off serving his country in various roles, this was his residence, and he died here in 1799. By 1858, the house and the grounds were in disrepair. They were in desperate need of restoration, you could say being saved. And yet, it was only 124 years old. I think many of us feel now that our democracy, over 200 years old, could use some work. Maybe we need some restoration. Maybe we need concerned people to step up and see if we can't make a difference. Because like the ladies who saved Mount Vernon, they stepped up with private funds and their energy, and through tough times carried it forward. They've left us something that matters. They've left something for the future. So it was mentioned there are, in the more perfect effort, there are 5 initiatives. There are 5 goals. And the reason this is important is because we can all say we're for democracy. If you go to all American people and you say, should we have good democracy? Almost everybody will say, absolutely. The difference between that kind of a comment and getting a better democracy is doing stuff. And so the 5 goals become essential levers that we can help to move our society and our nation in a better direction. The first is universal civic learning. That's pretty obvious to all of us. How can you have a country founded upon the participation of everyone without everyone having some understanding of how that works? George Washington said, what duty more pressing than communicating to those who are to be the future guardians of the liberty of the country? The second goal is national service and volunteering. Of course, we know that during the Revolutionary War, most of the Continental Army consisted of volunteers, militia, people who came out at great cause and risk to themselves. But George Washington also reminded us when we assumed the soldier, we did not lay aside the citizen. And we shall most sincerely rejoice with you in that happy hour when the establishment of American liberty on the most firm and solid foundation shall enable us to return to our private stations in the bosom of a free, peaceful, and happy country. The third is bridging divides. Every day we hear about, we read, and in some cases we personally experience the pain of divides. Sometimes it's very close. It's people that we are either in families or work or school with. And so it's particularly distressing. George Washington warned in the farewell address about the political divides that could haunt us. And he said, you have in common cause fought and triumphed together. The independence and liberty you possess are the work of joint councils and joint efforts of common dangers, suffering, and success. Your union ought to be considered as the main prop of your liberty, and the love of the one ought to endear you to the preservation of the other. The fourth goal is trusted elections and more representative and responsible governance. We are built on the concept of trust. In an autocratic nation where most of the citizens have no real choice in the governance they experience, it doesn't matter. But here, where we elect our leaders, where we follow decisions that are made, hopefully in a democratic fashion, that trust is just essential. We all have to believe that the process in which people were selected and then the processes that those elected leaders follow are fair. They're not perfect. They never will be, but they are fair. The fifth and last goal is access to trusted news and information, and we'll hear more about that. I frankly wasn't very familiar with that when we first started More Perfect, but the reality is to stay informed, to stay engaged, to do our part in democracy demands that we understand and we be informed. It also demands that we have the kind of a media that holds us all to account, whether we're in a position of trust or not. We're not gathered here tonight or this week to get any specific person elected. We're here to ensure that in the future, our children, and in my case, grandchildren, have the kind of nation where they get to pick who leads them. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the evening.
Thank you.
Good evening. It's always actually intimidating to follow Stan McChrystal.
Yes, it is.
But I will tell you a story. And by the way, neither rain or a crash on GW Parkway or gloomy skies have deterred you from your participation. So we're so grateful. I'm John Bridgeland, the CEO and founder of this enterprise called More Perfect. And when Stan was here for a national service summit, we were walking in and he kind of joked, "Hey, Bridge, you know, I'm a 4-star general and Washington was a 3-star. And I said, "But Stan, it's a bicentennial, they made him a 6-star. So you got 2 stars to go." First, I want to thank Mount Vernon. I've gotten to know Doug Bradburn and Julia and Megan and the team here at Mount Vernon. He's an extraordinary force. He connected us to the America 250 Commission, the Virginia 250 Commission, and has worked so hard to align efforts as we move toward a more perfect union. I also want to thank Stan. You know, he left serving 38 years in the U.S. Army and now dedicating a lot of his time and energy to help making civilian national service a rite of passage for young Americans in this country. And to the co-chairs of More Perfect, Stan, obviously, Melody Barnes, Cecilia Munoz, Alan Casey, Stephen Hines, and the team that's pulling together 82 leaders tomorrow for a full-day retreat at Mount Vernon to talk about, you know, I know the surround sounds pretty gloomy in the country, and Doug reinforced that with your statistics. But the progress that the country is making and can make in advancing these 5 democracy goals is really quite extraordinary. And when Doris Kearns Goodwin, the historian, was with us to launch More Perfect, she said, you know, all transformational change across U.S. history has first emerged from individual citizens who often had no political appointment or public position, but they had an idea and they fostered a movement and they changed this country. So in that spirit, when we launched More Perfect, it wasn't an auspicious start. The first person I reached out to said, "Bridge, collaborations are unnatural acts among non-consenting adults." But happily, because of just extraordinary people in this room who lead really outstanding institutions, and I'd actually like the people who are part of the More Perfect Alliance, which is 34 presidential centers from Washington's Mount Vernon through the Obama Foundation. Think of that, the collaboration across all that firepower. The National Archives Foundation, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which produced the bipartisan Our Common Purpose report from which the 5 democracies are drawn, Karsh Institute of Democracy, and more than 100 partners that are pulling together to advance, first define clear goals, targets in the short, mid to 50th and longer term, out at least a decade, and plans of action to meet them. So could those who were part of the More Perfect Alliance stand and be applauded for their collaboration? So Thank you. So now let's turn to these 5 extraordinary leaders who are at the center of each of the democracy goals. Daniel Allen is a professor at Harvard University, director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at the Kennedy School. You probably read her wonderful op-eds in the Washington Post regularly. She seems to be everywhere. Since we're at Mount Vernon, Stan referenced this, Washington strongly promoted civic education from his first address to the Congress in 1790 until his final address in 1796, even stressing the need for a national university and military academy. What is the state of play on civic education in the United States? What's Democracy Goal 1? Why is it so important? And if you could share the progress we're making.
Terrific. No, thank you so much, Bridge. And thank you to the Mount Vernon team for having us here. My dad is the person who published George Washington's Rules on Civility. It's now a very commonly accessible text, but it means I grew up with Washington's Rules of Civility. And, but I've never been to Mount Vernon. Don't tell my dad. So I'm really grateful to be here. We are in a really exciting place with civic learning in the country. There is a lot of work to do. You heard from the beginning, but I want to really tell you a story about hope and progress. First, so what motivates me in this work? There's one data point that keeps me up at night. You may have heard it. It is the one about how for generations born before World War II, roughly 70% consider it essential to live in a democracy. In contrast, for folks who are millennials and younger, so low 40s and younger, not quite 30% consider it essential to live in a democracy. It's very straightforward that you can't have a democracy unless people want one. And that data point tells me that we haven't, as older folks, done our job of generational transition and inheritance, passing on our inheritance to rising generations. That is what the project of universal civic learning is. It is to pass on that inheritance, but also to equip rising generations to take that inheritance forward in the new forms it has to adapt into in the 21st century. Why do we talk about universal civic learning? We are working pre-K to gray, so it is K through 12, but it is also lifelong learning in support of civic participation and reflective patriotism. It is also out of school as well as in school. So there are all kinds of ways people can learn from books. They can learn from simulations in the classroom, but they can also learn through the Girl Scouts. They can learn through Junior ROTC. So we need to support that whole ecosystem. We are making progress. We are at a point where there are only 2 states left, Maine and Alaska, where there's not any kind of civics course in the curriculum in schools. So that's good progress. And we are working on Maine and Alaska. I mean, they may be like a little harder to get to, but they will not escape us. And also, though, of course, what matters is the quality and robustness of the curriculum. And there we're really focused on expanding what we do at the middle school level, grade 8, to that point, like what's the age where people are really coming into understanding of their civic experience. There, 10 states do require a grade 8 or a middle school course, and we intend to get to 50. And for that, we definitely need your help and engagement. The last thing I'll say is that this entire field, K through 12, in school and out of school, higher ed, as well as K through 12, has started to organize around something called the Educating for American Democracy Roadmap. This is a content guide. It is not standards. It is not a curriculum. It's a set of questions that every kid should have the chance to encounter over the course of their learning journey. And the important thing about this is that it was the product of 300 scholars, educators, and practitioners from around the country, diverse in every dimension: geography, professional expertise, viewpoint, everything. It was a project that was funded by both the Trump and the Biden administrations. Okay? So they said it couldn't be done. Okay? They said it couldn't be done, but we've done it. We've got a shared field-wide view of what counts as excellence in history and civic learning. It turns around the dispositions of reflective patriotism, civil disagreement, and a commitment to pluralism in our country. And again, we need your help and engagement with this work to expand implementations of this around the country. Thank you.
Fantastic. Put Danielle and Louise DeBay and Jane Kometsky and people on the case, and the system moves. Stan, you mentioned that, Washington said when we assumed the soldier, we did not lay aside the citizen. As as a citizen and a soldier. Tell us about the big idea of civilian national service, your vision for it, what you think we might be able to move toward the 250th and progress we're making.
Yeah, well, thanks. And first, I just want to note that you reminded us that George Washington said there should be a military academy. He really only said one, West Point. When they did Navy, that was way a mistake. But I think what you just asked me is really the second part of what Danielle just said. You build a foundation of civic education, and it has to start young, and it has to build. But I also think experience is part of that. One of the things I experienced in the military is we all go in because I joined really when I was 17. It was just the end of the draft era, so most of my career was all volunteer force. People would come in and they would accept the idea of service, and they would accept the values that they were exposed to in large part, and they would change them as people during the course of even a single enlistment or a longer period. And yet less than 30% of young Americans qualify to enter into the military. More than 70% couldn't if they wanted to. Plus, we don't have a big military, so you don't need it. But every young American needs an experience where they do something important, they do something immersive, they feel good about that. And so one of the things I got involved in civilian national service, largely because people like Alan and Bridge, when I get out, I'd never thought about it before, because we need to give the rest of young America that opportunity. And we can't just be for upper middle class kids whose parents can support them. It's got to be for everybody, so people from multiple zip codes get that experience where you work with people that you don't normally know. And you have that experience for a year or maybe longer in education, healthcare, conservation, anything. And I think you come out a different person because that experience builds upon the civic education that it reminds you this thing's really got to work. And really having to work is people rolling up their sleeves and doing it. I also learned years ago that if you make people pick up trash along the highway, they don't litter as much. And so when everybody feels like they are a stockholder in our democracy, they have a different attitude. They vote at a higher percentage. They are engaged at a higher percentage. They feel as though they're entitled to have a view because they've done something. We need to give every young American a realistic opportunity to do that. And in my opinion, a good nudge in the back, encouraging to do that as well.
It's great. And thanks to Stan, the Department of Defense is sharing information with the 77% of young Americans who are trying to enter the military who are disqualified so they can enroll in the Peace Corps or AmeriCorps or Vista.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's really good. And a goal of 1 million national service participants by 2050. So Manu Meal is the founder and executive director of a wonderful program called Bridge USA, working on college campuses. And I wanted Manu here for two reasons. One, polarization is what's ripping this country apart. And second, he represents Gen Z, the next generation that's working on the ground to address it. So Manu, tell us about your journey from being a pre-med student to starting Bridge USA, and then the hope you're seeing in college campuses around the country.
Yeah, my mom is still confused. So I am your Gen Z tribute for the night, and importantly, I do not represent Gen Z. I'm purely one of, I think, many amazing young people doing really great work. I just want to give a big thank you to Bridge, to General, to everybody else here for organizing this. I stand on some really tall shoulders, I think, as it comes to thinking about the work of polarization. So I'm thinking the best way to approach this, and my mind is being a little bit shaped right now as it relates to bridging divides because of an experience that our team is having right now as we speak, which is we have college and high school chapters across the country that focus on equipping young people to be able to have conversations and empowering them to say that, when somebody says, sit down and be quiet, you actually show up and have the civic dialogue for the sake of understanding. So as you can imagine, the anniversary of October 7th is approaching. And we've got these chapters across the country. And as I was sharing with Professor Allen in the reception, we are focused on organizing an event. Oh, you're going to say, this guy's really naive. Focused on organizing an event about Israel-Palestine tomorrow at Columbia University. student-led. And for whatever reason, that event isn't going to happen. It's going to be postponed. And right now I'm thrown back to February 2nd, 2017, and you're going to ask, where's the hope in all this? And actually, I think there's actually a lot of hope right now in the moment. But just wait and stick with me for a quick second as we go through a little bit of the hardship. So this event is going to happen tomorrow, Bridge. And this isn't the first time that a university administration, students, faculty have not let a conversation like this happen. Not approaching it from an ideological agenda, approaching it from the goal of, I don't know, maybe people with different viewpoints might want to have conversations with each other. It might be a good thing. In 2017, when I was a pre-med student, I had no interest in any of this work. I was not one of those people that was like, when they were birthed, they were like, I'm going to be, start an organization. No interest. February 2nd, 2017, we had a speaker come to campus named Milo Yiannopoulos, who was sort of this provocateur. He's dropped off the map a little bit. And he showed up to campus, and that evening, I distinctly remember I was walking back from a math seminar, and I heard helicopters flying overhead, and I saw the cafe window smashed in. Now, this is Berkeley, so this is kind of par for the course. Thus far, nothing different has happened yet. It's like, where are we headed, right? So inside the cafe, there was a TV screen. It said CNN, UC Berkeley students protest free speech, which was interesting. And the crazy thing about that moment was the television crew that was filming that moment was sitting right next to me. And that was sort of the breaking the fourth wall. I was like, wow, this is what they talk about in those history books, right? Turns out that was one of the largest protests in Berkeley's history since the 60s, since Dr. King came to campus. The next day, me and some random people who are now some of my best friends, we got together and we said, what we're going to do is we're just going to create a space for listening and conversation, not for the sake of trying to bridge differences, but for the sake of helping people see that maybe the person that you disagree with isn't evil. Let's just get there. Now, I'm telling you this in hindsight, and you're sitting here, you're saying, after the largest protest in the history of the university, you're going to get these people to come together and have a conversation. A very naive proposition, just like tomorrow's. So these students get together. We called it Bridge Berkeley. The first event, 75 folks showed up, which for us at that time was a big opportunity. 40 of them left 10 minutes in because they thought it was a civic architecture frat. They said, we're building bridges. And said, at least we got them there, right? The second event, we got everybody together and everyone was on pins and needles, right? That fear element was there. Chancellor Dirks at that time felt that it was important to have this conversation, but the values was led by these students. And different members showed up. And what's fascinating about that moment was instead of starting to talk about each other's policy views and stances, my friend Ross, who's the co-founder of Bridge, he had a brilliant idea. He said, let's share vulnerability. Let's start talking about where we come from, what brings us together, what's the name of your mom, how many siblings you got. And man, that vulnerability cut through ignorance like a hot knife through butter. That day, my friends and I learned one thing, which was that we radically overestimate how divided we are, and we radically underestimate the possibility of a conversation, right? The next week, we got all these folks together, and they started growing, they started building, and you started seeing that people were coming out of the woodwork saying, I like that, but don't tell anybody else. Don't tell anybody else. Tomorrow at Columbia, you fast forward. You've got a dynamic where you've got everybody from leadership to students to faculty. And this sort of speaks to phenomenons in our neighborhood where people are listening to each other, they're willing to hear each other, and yet there seems to be loud vocal extremes across the political spectrum that are not ideologically united, but temperamentally united, that are, I think, building not division, but a culture of fear, which is different. So the question then becomes, as it relates to the Bridging Divides pillar, what does success look like? And there's some amazing organizations that do some amazing work, some of them that are represented today. I'm only a small piece of that. And one of the things that we're focused on is, I think, the way you start to battle a norms battle, which is different than a policy battle. It's a norms battle. where culture of fear is being pit against a desire for human curiosity, is you got to have an air game and you got to have a ground game. The air game is where our hope as a pillar is to activate 1 million Americans in collective campaigns across the country, marketing campaigns, visual campaigns, TV ads. The idea being, hey, when you're sitting on your couch and you're saying, man, this is terrible. Not only are you not alone, but your neighbor is probably thinking the exact thing. And the second element, the ground game, is our goal is to activate 250,000 Americans in 4 different sectors: faith, higher ed, federal and local legislatures, which are essential to mobilizing different members of Congress. And finally, we look at communities that are civically based in those local institutions. So you got activation across the ground and you're building the air campaign. Last thing I'll just say, Bridge, is that I think we have to shift this narrative from the great divide to the great misunderstanding. You might think it is very naive. But time and time again, I have yet to encounter the Twitter mob in real life. Dave Chappelle said, Twitter is not real life. This is. And so our goal objectively as a pillar is, let's just elevate that silent majority and make them hopeful.
And you've got networks on like 70 plus college campuses. Just
we're on about 75 college campuses, 35 high schools now, because as Dr. Allen said, this problem's starting earlier.
That's great. So get your little QR code, get the questions come. I only have 2, and they're both for Danielle. I'll come back to you in a minute. But I'd love to integrate your questions into the discussion. So Zach Wamp, Republican U.S. Congressman for 16 years. When I was in the White House, he was my favorite congressman to work with. He puts country over party again and again and again. And now he's working with an incredible organization led by Nick Penniman called Issue One, which is addressing our collapse in trust in elections. So, Zach, tell us about where we are in terms of addressing this difficult circumstance of a lack of trust in elections, violence to election officials, what can be done about it. And the second question I have for you, because the second piece of Democracy Goal 1 is effective governance. If you had to name one thing that could change in Congress to move it away from sort of identity politics to problem solving again, what would it be?
So this question has touched my heart and stirred my soul for decades in my life. And the question is, can free people actually govern themselves? This is an experiment, and it's an ongoing experiment, whether we can keep the republic. And part of keeping the republic is that we separate ourselves from the rest of the world because we hold free and fair elections, as General McChrystal said, not perfect, but free and fair elections, and accept the results and peacefully transfer power. You can argue American exceptionalism on healthcare, education, military strength, all these other things, but you really can't argue that for 248 years, no country on the planet has done this as well as we do it, which is citizen-led. Our friends and neighbors at the state and local level hold these elections periodically. We accept the results. I've lost elections and I've won elections. You've got to learn in life, whether you're a child or a grown-up, to be a good loser. You even have to learn how to be a good winner if you're going to succeed in a free society. And this is fundamental to our way of life. In fact, it makes us exceptional. But the problem is, 40 million people have sort of been brainwashed that you can't trust this system of elections in this country. And I think some of them, as you just referenced, are just misinformed. They're not bad people. They're just misinformed. For whatever reason, we know how some of this came about. But between now and 2026, we really desire to restore and strengthen this norm of accepting the results of elections, opposing all political violence, and having a peaceful transfer of power. It is fundamental. In order to accomplish that, I believe, because I came from the United States Congress for a number of years, you have to have some form of compromise, which means both sides have to give a little and get a little. And I wrote an op-ed earlier this week. This is not Issue One's policy position. It's mine. And I laid out 5 things that should be done to begin the road to recover trust in our elections in this country. And they include both sides giving a little. We have a problem too that the national government's not involved in these elections. And I would argue not near enough. The national government's not involved, because when you look at election security now is not at state and local level. It may be China or Iran or a foreign country meddling with our communication systems or confusing everyone to meddle in our elections. That means the federal government has to be involved at some level. And I would argue at the funding level of election security, the federal government has a very prominent role to play. And we could even come up with grant programs, as we do with the blood alcohol content on drunk driving at the state level. Those laws are set at the state level. But, oh, by the way, if you don't meet a certain threshold for blood alcohol content, you don't get the federal portion of your highway grants that every 5 years are reauthorized. Why couldn't we do that with election funding for infrastructure for the states so that you meet these best practices? What would a best practice look like, Bridge? A best practice would say that every state should have a certain amount of early voting and absentee voting, but that all of those early votes would be processed prior to the election day, so that, like the state of Florida, by midnight on election day, we know who won. Ladies and gentlemen, in 41 days in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, because the legislatures of those 2 states have failed to act, they don't begin counting the pre-votes, the early votes, the absentee votes, until the polls close. So we won't know who won Pennsylvania until probably Friday. We might not know who won Wisconsin until Thursday. What does that feed? It feeds the conspiracy theorists. It feeds the people who don't want to accept the outcome of elections. Let us find ways to compromise and incentivize so that these people can actually have the faith they deserve in the institutions. Now, the one thing I said to you on the way down here today that I'd love to see on terms of restoring confidence and ending polarization is, as soon as you get elected to Congress, you really don't meet the people from the other party until 2 months later when you're sworn in. Because immediately the Republicans take the Republicans here, the Democrats take the Democrats here, and they basically brainwash you into thinking that the other team is the enemy. Not ISIS or the Communist Party from China, but literally the other team is the enemy. When I was a freshman, the reason I lived the bipartisan thing is I thought, what a privilege it is to be one of 11,000 Americans to serve in the United States Congress, and I'm by far the most ignorant person on this dais and probably in the whole room. But I love the privilege of serving. So I thought, what can I do to make this place better? And I thought, I'm going to learn the first name of all 434 of my colleagues, and I'm going to call every one of them by their first name. Oh. And man, you should have seen Bernie Sanders the first time he's walking, reading while he's walking. And I said, hey, Bernie. He thought, man, are you a Republican saying hi to Bernie? Listen, I had friends from Barney Frank to John Lewis that Republicans would never have, because I learned to call people by their first name. Small steps, big steps, appreciating who they are, where they came from. Henry Nouwen calls it the ministry of presence. We need to sit and listen to each other more and understand we're all the same. We just disagree on a few things, just like a family. And that's what we are, the American family. So small steps will begin the path back to where we need to be.
Awesome. We got to get you back in Congress, Zach. That was
wow. That was awesome.
We're going to start doing questions here, but Dale Anglin, inaugural executive director of an extraordinary initiative called Press Forward, led by the MacArthur Foundation and John Palfrey, who together they're literally moving a nation on a sense of shared truth and rescuing local news from its collapse. Dale, tell us about it. Progress you're making, the goals for the future, and please put out those numbers that you've been raising.
Good numbers. First, I want to say my daughter did AmeriCorps, changed her life.
Good.
And I worked in Congress, and I remember when they created national service. So I'm such a fan of everything you guys are saying. So, but none of this matters if you don't know it exists. And what's happening over the last 20 years, and many of you already know this, I was talking to somebody earlier today, is what people think of as the demise of local news, right? We've lost reporters, we've lost outlets, and instead what's replacing that is only national, only the misinformation, only the disinformation. And so you don't know your neighbors. You don't know sports down the street. You don't know the person died. You don't know even obits anymore. And it turns out, can I get a hand? If you raise your hand, if you or somebody in your family was in the local newspaper at some point that you can remember. Right. We had immediate access to local news. We trusted it because we knew it. We knew the person who ran the paper, the publisher, the reporter. When you don't have that, it turns out we're missing something. And over the last 20 years, there's a lot of research, and you can just look it up, over what happens when you don't have that. And when you don't have it, you have elected officials. I love them, but they don't act as well. They need to be watched a little bit. You don't have the camaraderie that happens in communities. And this has nothing to do with Democrat, Republican, small, big, ethnic. It doesn't matter. You don't have it. You don't have it. You don't know who each other are. You don't trust each other. And so we have lots of research that talks now about what happens when you don't have it. I worked for foundations for a long time, and the foundation started to realize as ad revenue left all of these outlets, which is one of the reasons we lost all of those outlets, what could we do to help revitalize that community? And so we've created a thing called Press Forward. It's pledged so far $500 million over the next 5 years to help revitalize local news. And I'm charged with raising on top of that $500 million. So please help me. And I'll just say there's lots of bright spots. We are at the point now, and we've got 4 pillars. If you're going to do this, you can't boil the ocean. You have to really focus and target what you're going to focus on. So we're focused on policy because we believe there's a role for public financing in local news. You can do it in a way that is not partisan. There's a role for infrastructure because every industry has to figure out how to support and build capacity for these publishers and all of these outlets that still exist but just need help. You have a lot of reporters who've started new things, for profit or nonprofit, but they're not used to the business side of the work, but you can train them up on the business side. We're focused on sustainability. How do you get the ones that currently exist? There are about 6,000 outlets still around in our country. How do you get them to sustainable revenue sources? And then the last one, the one that I'll talk the most about, is locals. And so it turns out this is a local problem. And so you couldn't have national foundations, and now we're up to almost 90 foundations, local and national, that are a part of this work, that have pledged to give more money than what they gave in the past toward local news. And more than half of them have never given to local news before. So we're helping build the field of journalism philanthropy. We're now at 31 chapters in 28 states. I'm very proud to say that. And those chapters are our local, on-the-ground foundations, working with outlets, working with other partners like universities and libraries to think through what should the local news ecosystem look like in your region. Your region could be a city. It could be several counties. It could be a state. In Minnesota, the whole state is working together. We're going to announce soon Arkansas, Washington State are working together. In Texas, Bridge would know this, we're going to have multiple chapters because there's no one state in Texas. California, we've got multiple chapters. Yeah. But the bottom line is it's local foundations, local donors thinking locally with their outlets about what exists. And the last thing I'll say is that we want to build and revitalize this industry. And there's lots of bright spots. I could talk about that later, of places where this is happening. We see it happening. They are sustainable with a little bit of philanthropy and finding other revenue streams. But you do have to build it back better. Because when we had all the news in the past, for the last 100, 200 years, it never represented everybody that it should have represented. We didn't have all the right people reporting. We didn't have people with lived experience reporting about their own lived experiences. We didn't have things in languages. We learned this in COVID, right? You can look up some of our newer outlets started in COVID with health information because people needed it for life or death purposes in their own language. And then they realized that some of those people had never had information in their language or in the way that they would like to get it. So one of the great examples is in Minnesota. Sahan Journal started to focus on the Ethiopian and the Somalian community. Let me be clear, they've been there for 20, 30 years. They just never had a journal focused on them. They are sustainable. They are replicable. We've got that happening all over the country. I'd love to talk anything about all of the different places where we have chapters. If you don't have a chapter, come see me, because we're hoping that by this time next year, we have a chapter in every single state.
3 years ago, it didn't exist. Remarkable. So questions, Danielle, how do we put a priority on civic education when all the incentives gravitate towards STEM? And then how do we modernize civic education so that younger generations engage with it in ways that are consistent with how they're accessing news and information. These are questions from Julie and Steve.
And you didn't warn them that I would spend 2 hours talking about questions like that. So those are fantastic questions, and they're really on point. So I mentioned the effort to work with states to have states add requirements to their structure for K through 12. And that is the answer for changing incentives and making space again in K through 12 for civic education. It is true that over the last 50 years, for a lot of reasons, the country has really invested again and again in STEM education. And not so much in civic education. We need that STEM education, but it's really both and. So we reached a point about 3 years ago where we were investing about $54 of federal monies per kid per year in STEM education and only 5 cents per kid per year in civic ed. We've gotten that 5 cents up to 50 cents again, which is good news. Again, we hit bottom, in other words, and we're turning it around. But we have to get back there so that it really is both and. We're doing as well for civics as STEM. So there's something called the Civic Secures Democracy Act that I would encourage you all to take a look at, talk to your legislators about, because that will help support the states too in bringing in additional requirements and elevating what they're asking of their K-12 systems. And then in terms of modernizing, this is the wonderful thing about the Educating for America Democracy Roadmap. It is a living project with educators all over the country working on exactly the question of how to renew and revitalize civic learning. Some of that is about things like games. So iCivics, Louise Dubé is here, and they have spread the use of digital games throughout civic learning across the country, the biggest civic education provider in the country. My enterprise uses project-based learning. You can deliver core knowledge about philosophical foundations of democracy, core institutions of government, and so forth through project-based learning structures that have been shown to be more engaging for kids. So the point is, I suppose, that there is a lot of innovation happening right now. And so again, I really encourage you to check out the Civics Now website for the policy piece, those incentives, and check out the Educating for American Democracy roadmap for this innovation.
Fantastic. And could you, a little round of applause for Louise Dubé and iCivics, founded by Sandra Day O'Connor. And all these states now have civic course requirements. It's awesome. She said she was from Canada and she blushes a lot, so I wanted to make her blush. General McChrystal, Liam and Ian have wonderful questions. Can you elaborate on why only 30% of young people are eligible to serve in the military? So the 70 plus that are disqualified. And then how do you incentivize civil service or military service for the next generation beyond altruism? And finally, what about mandatory civilian national service?
Yeah, no. I want to start with that, but the reason most young people that are disqualified, it's a range of things from some physical issues that goes from obesity to other, more severe disabilities. And then there's criminal issues, there's drug use, there's all of these things. And unfortunately, of what's left are the same pool that are in great demand by many businesses, colleges, and whatnot. So you've really got a pretty small pool that everybody wants to go to. And the military, of course, wants to keep the standards as high as possible. So you got to be a high school grad and that sort of thing. So that does that. So that's part of that. In terms of incentivizing, it's interesting. The military came up with, well, not the military, the nation came up with the GI Bill really after the Second World War as a way to educate people that they wanted to be educated in society. And then the military, particularly in the volunteer era, has used that as an incentive to enter. But it's really good for two things. It's good, one, to get people to enter the service, but it's good because we want them educated afterward anyway. And so they're doing something that is a good thing. But strictly money doesn't work. You can throw an awful lot of money at people. You've got to give them an experience that makes sense to them, and the military's got to work on that because what we asked young soldiers and sailors and airmen to do before is not what we need them to do now. There's a high-tech part. There's a judgment part. We really need much more out of them. We've got to offer that to them. You can't have an environment that is so stupefying. And you also got to protect females. No parents want to send their daughters in if they think they're not going to be safe. And so the military's got to create an environment, and they do pretty well. generally the military's made a lot of progress and all, but it's a great big beast and you're trying to do things on a daily basis. Now, mandatory. Everybody has a fantasy that they have when it's dark and nobody's around, and mine is mandatory. I'm a believer in mandatory military service. Not for everybody, but for the ones you need, and mandatory civilian service. But it polls terribly. If we poll it for young people, they don't like it. You poll it for old people, they don't like it. I think America is just in that era. We don't like anything mandatory. We could give out free money, and if it was mandatory, people wouldn't want it. I think if people felt it was fair, and if they felt that it made sense, what you were brought in to do had some value, you weren't just wasting your time, I think people would get over that mandatory thing in no time. And they would have this shared experience, and they'd joke about it. They'd say, where did you serve? And everybody would have that period of life where they went off and did something different that's different, for the most part, what they did later. But that's a mindset we and the nation have got to take on.
Yeah, that's great. No greater advocate for mandatory national service. So Brian asks a question. So the problems are so paralyzing, the environment's gloomy. How do we restore, Manu, for the next generation, a sense of hope, confront apathy? Alan Casey wrote a book called Big Citizenship, and that's sort of been the spirit of the country since the beginning. How do we create a culture of big citizenship where particularly young people see that they can make a difference and how they can make a difference?
I think the general's advocacy for this notion that you have to be a stockholder, that was the phrase, correct? A stockholder in democracy, I think, is pivotal because it goes from feeling like you're an inheritor to an owner of the experiment. And I think one of the challenges that a lot of young people face right now, from our viewpoint, is not one of polarization, but it's one of apathy. I think the real poison that my generation is going to have to contend with is that we're growing up in a very skeptical period, right? So take me, for example. I was born 3 years before 9/11. I graduated middle school in 2008, which was during the financial recession. Then in 2016, I graduated high school, which was President Trump and Secretary Clinton's election. Graduated 2020 in college into the pandemic, Jan 6. Not a great sample size. And so as a result, you have a generation that I think is highly skeptical. And this isn't new. This has happened before in American history. What's fascinating about the different pillars that are, I think, present here today is that each of us are addressing, I think, a different element of the puzzle. And the puzzle element that we're specifically focused on is this notion that when you have a generation that's highly skeptical, I think you feed that generation into two pathways, which is why I think this is a battle of norms. This, for me, is not about bridging left to right. This is a battle of norms. And the two pathways are, one is the pathway of fear, skepticism, and anger. It's about leading by turning people against each other, which is very easy. The number one thing we talk about in our high schools and our colleges is that we're not worried that you're not going to be engaged. My brother, who's in 10th grade, is more informed than I ever was. Highly informed. What I'm worried about is how you will lead. So pathway number two. Pathway number two is you channel that skepticism into fuel for recognizing that the United States by 2045 is going to be the most diverse democracy in the history of humanity. This has never happened before at this scale. So when students come to us on a college campus and they say, man, it's really difficult to have this conversation. I don't know if I can host this. I don't know if I can hold the civic fabric together. I don't know if I can listen to people that are different than me. The response to them is, that's actually normal. Because this experiment is fundamentally transformative and ambitious. Not greatest, not worst, ambitious. And so suddenly then students start to say, oh, I'm actually a pioneer of something. I'm pioneering probably what I think is the most fundamental human experiment that has ever happened before. This idea that we're going to build a society, e pluribus unum, out of many one. This notion that people of very different backgrounds, 330 million people, heavily armed.
Yeah. Yeah.
are going to make it work. So when you make the proposition that actually you're on the offense, having the conversation is the most courageous thing you could actually do. That the outrage industrial complex, Amanda Ripley, our colleague, has written about, this idea that at a time when outrage sells, it makes you rich, it brings you influence, you're actually going to listen. You are the rebel. Suddenly, it goes from civic dialogues as broccoli to civic dialogues are essential to the pioneering experiment. Does that help?
That helps a lot.
Beautiful.
And Zach, you're next because we got sure.
Zach and I saw each other in 2019, and I've been learning from Congressman Wapp for 5 years. And when I first saw him in Nashville, the leadership that you emanated at that time, where you created space for us, was amazing. So thank you.
Yeah. Nothing like
Yes, sir.
Nothing like compassionate, strong leadership. So Sydney and Robin have questions about elections. The one is, do you feel voting by mail has reduced the security of the vote, has led to fraud in any way? And second, this is Steve, if we were going to, Robin, create a state-of-the-art of democracy today, would we really have the Electoral College? I touched base with two Rove and Axe on each side, and I asked them, what does it come down to? And at one point they said 200 to 400,000 votes in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, which seems very undemocratic. So thoughts?
Yeah, so the perspective on the Electoral College just really depends on which state you live in, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because the small states going all the way from the very beginning just didn't want to be completely bypassed because of the extraordinary growth in the urban areas of this country. And that still holds true. And frankly, that's an issue that we can debate, but it's not near as imminent or critical today as holding elections without violence, accepting the results, and peacefully transferring power. So let's stay focused on today's problem, and then we can debate that one however long you want to debate that. What was the first question?
Mail,
whether voting by mail, any evidence of fraud.
I don't even know if Nick Penniman, the founder of Issue 1, is here, because we have a lot of different components of the discussion around how can we improve elections, because we do need to improve elections. And what's the federal role versus the state role? And, how can we restore confidence? But in this op-ed that I wrote, I said that I thought we ought to do away with drop boxes. And that's one thing that a lot of Democrats will say, why? But it's just like a good faith effort to let's just vote by mail. Why? There are strict federal laws about messing with the United States mail. And we have states like Colorado that vote by mail very well, very securely. You can trust the United States mail. It is a federal function. And yes, you can vote by mail and it is secure. And you can find accidentally they registered 300 people in Oregon on the DMV because you can get a driver's license and you don't have to be a citizen, and they accidentally gave them voter registration, and that was a mistake. But that doesn't lead to widespread fraud that influences the outcome of a federal election. You can point to all these little things, but overall, yes, you can trust voting by mail. You can trust voting early. I do like the individual engagement. That's what I don't like about drop boxes. I don't know who handled the drop box. I don't know who put the things in there. I know you can have somebody that's sworn to make sure, but that's at the local level. I just think in a good faith effort, we ought to have, and this is the other side that some people get mad about, we ought to have voter identification. You got to do everything else in this country to have an ID. Why would you not have to prove that you're a U.S. citizen in order to vote? So these are things that both sides give a little. We come up with a new set of norms and best practices, and everybody that's complained because somebody brainwashed them that we don't have good elections, it's wrong. But everybody that complained can say, well, they changed it. If we don't make changes, don't expect them to conform their mindset about whether we can trust our elections. The goal is that we all trust our elections. And anyone, frankly, who says something, which happens to me a lot, about mail or whatever, I don't just ignore them and walk away. We are in a society where we have to share with each other. If we know better, I tell people this is something I actually know a lot about. And yes, you can trust voting by mail. because we are in this together, and you can't just assume that if you don't say anything that they're somehow going to get better information from someone else. So yes, I think you can trust the mail, but I would throw out drop boxes just because it would be a good faith effort to restore trust.
Yeah. And if you're interested in more information, Issue 1 on its website, and led by Nick and Kara and Zach and this incredible National Council of Election Integrity of all these former members of Congress across politics are working together, foster trust in elections, shore up the people like Brad Raffensperger and Bill Gates Jr. and these heroic election officials around the country and just doing extraordinary work.
Try to hold people accountable that are misrepresenting the truth, which gets to your issue as well, because that really everything we're doing up here together may be running parallel, but we do cross over into each other's business a lot, and necessarily so.
Yeah. You guys are so great, by the way. The questions seem to be coming in the order of the democracy goals. And it's very easy as a moderator. Dale, this is a question from Anonymous. I guess I've been calling people's names out too much. How can, in an age where social media, young people in particular, have all this information at their fingertips, how can local news remain relevant, keep up?
Yep.
And why is this such an important part of the democracy goal enterprise?
Yeah. So, I spend my time these days speaking to three types of people. I talk to journalists and publishers, I talk to funders, and I talk to our local chapters, trying to encourage them to do their work. And when I talk to journalists, frankly, I tell them you can't be writing or doing what you did 10 years ago and expect everybody to come there now. Audience changes constantly, not just young people. Actually, a lot of people in the audience change how you want your news, what you want from your news. And frankly, I would ask everybody to figure out, who are you supporting around local news? Is there anything in your community that you think is good? And I would ask you to support it. And what they are often doing in a good way is figuring out day to day how to work with AI. They're trying to figure out how to support young people. We have examples of young people doing news. The student journalists at Columbia are heroes.
They're amazing.
They are amazing. We're about to do 205 grants, $20 million in 2 weeks, to 205 outlets all around the country, and a number of those will be college newsrooms, because we want to show the world that we have lots of bright spots and things that are happening in the world today. And by the way, we have things that are Instagram only. They are text only. We have things that some are still in print. So every mode that you want news in, many of our outlets are experimenting with these days. They need our support to continue those experiments. Frankly, no one has solved this problem. And it's not going to get solved. It's, can you keep up? Do you have the runway, revenue sources, diversified revenue sources, and frankly, trained people on your staff, including some volunteers? We've got citizen journalists. One of my favorite things these days, if you haven't heard about it, is called documenters. Started in Chicago. There are now 20 sites around the country and expanding. You can sign up from the age of 16 to the age of 80. In Cleveland, where I live, we have almost 1,000 documenters. What they do is they document public meetings. That used to happen in news a long time ago. You would hear about what was happening in the library board meeting, in the school board meeting, in the city council meeting. Many of our current newspapers don't do that anymore. Documenters now do that. They get paid $16 to $20 an hour to do that. My daughter's a documenter. And what it showed and it's a first way into new ways of doing outlets, because what it shows is there's a demand for this work. It takes those documenter stories, turns them into news stories. Documenters have become reporters. It's a way for people. All of this is about people feeling that they are involved, that they are contributing to our democracy. You can do that through national service. You can do that through learning in school. You can do that through conversations. You can do that through being an election official, right? Volunteer. In the journalism space, you can also do that by starting outlets. We've got a dentist, former nurse. Their outlet died in Mississippi, and 10 years ago they said, we're going to start a newspaper. And with the help of their community, only 25,000 people in that community, they have done that. There are ways to get involved, and there are ways to encourage young people to get involved. We just have to do it.
Nancy Gibbs, who is editor of Time, runs Shorency, now calls local news democracy's immune system.
Antidote.
That's a good term.
Antidote.
I also wanted to call out Jeff Pillay from the Ford Presidential Center and Mike Ford and Jason Carter from the Carter Presidential Center just co-hosted an extraordinary event in the battleground state of Michigan, where President Carter and President Ford, for over 20 years, they worked together on the Federal Election Reform Commission that led to the Helping America Vote Act. And there are such stunning examples in the country where extraordinary institutions across politics are coming together. President George W. Bush hosted the first launch event for More Perfect before the 2022 midterms. $20 million out to 5 battleground states to push back on misinformation, disinformation. All the candidates for Secretary of State and Governor who were election deniers lost because of the work of a lot of institutions. And Kathy Roth-Duquet, Blue Star veterans, Blue Star families, and We the Veterans have been working to mobilize the highly trusted veterans community to close the poll worker gap and to step up to really reinforce our election system. So I just wanted to highlight a few of those. Charlie Hyde, who's the head of the Benjamin Harrison Presidential Site, has a question. I visited it in Indianapolis. It's an amazing place. And it's for you, Danielle, with tacit acknowledgement that schools have and will continue to teach to the test. Should a strategic imperative be to implement a national civics exam?
There is a lot packed into that question. A lot packed into that. So yes, at the end of the day, we need our educational accountability systems in every state to include social studies and civics. That would be an important change to get there. I don't think we should have a national test. At the end of the day, it really does matter that states set the educational agenda for that state. That diversity is an important part of who we are as a country. In Educating for American Democracy, we worked really hard to build a national conversation that red states and blue states could all participate in. We could be part of the same conversation, part of the same experimental field of practice, same field of innovation, and also recognize that there will be sort of different flavors of things done in different parts of the country. That's that story of sharing that we're all telling here. So it's really, really important that we not push for a single national exam in the civic learning space, but we can and should push our states to include social studies and civics in the accountability structures that they have in their states. I want to say one last thing because there's another complicated issue in this space. A lot of folks are really excited about using the U.S. citizen test that immigrants take as that national test for civics accountability. In the first blush, people think, oh, that sounds really great. That's a standard. Why not? It's a dangerous approach to connect citizenship to the results of your educational system. It is the slippery slope to literacy tests. And that is exactly how Vivek Ramaswamy used that policy in the election. So another reason why it's so important that states do build real and robust accountability. That test is also not very good as an accountability test for civics. Let me just as a content and caliber question. It's the wrong thing to do educationally. That's why we need our states, every state, to take its responsibility for accountability, not a national test, and certainly not the citizenship exam.
Very good. By the way, I wanted to call out Tina Chen's here from the Obama Foundation. President Obama, as part of his Democracy Forum in Chicago, which was it was like a revival. It was extraordinary. Way to go, Tina. But they featured the local news enterprise of Press Forward, and Judy Woodruff moderated the panel, and it was just such a hopeful, a hope spot in the country. This next question, I think, is from a former congressman and attorney general. And I won't call out his name because people are putting anonymous now. But how do you propose to introduce the Federalist Papers into the civic education campaign? Perhaps the best study of all governance in one place is ignored. What a great question. Thank you, Congressman, Attorney General.
Am I allowed to take that one too?
Yeah, you get it.
Well, I love the Federalist Papers, so whoever asks that question, and I will say it's core to my teaching practice at the university level. And so that's been one of the interesting areas for experimentation working in K through 12 is how can you take texts like that are really hard to read and help especially younger learners access them again. So in, again, the Educating for American Democracy project, we focus on inquiry, we focus on primary sources. The Constitution is hard for kids to read. The Declaration of Independence is hard for kids to read. But if you take the use of primary sources seriously, start with Declaration of Independence, have kids read it out loud. You can build from there, and you can include the Federalist Papers, especially 10 and 51, just in case you're wondering, in high school curricula. So it's doable, but you've got to focus on scaffolding inquiry, scaffolding engagements with primary sources from really early grades. K through 5, they can do civic learning too. They can listen to the Declaration out loud. So there's no too early for civic learning.
That's great. And Danielle has a wonderful book on the Declaration where she talks about we hold these truths to be self-evident, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of it's an inquiry for the next generation. It's just so inspiring. General McChrystal, you talk to Americans, institutions, businesses, nonprofits, military families, veterans communities all over the country and the world. And you have a forthcoming book, the privilege to read, called On Character, which literally caused me to review my own life and whether the values and character and the choices I've made live up to my values and character. And America needs a life review. And as we move toward the 250th anniversary of the birth of the nation, any thoughts or reflections on how we can have sort of America's debrief?
Yeah.
And apply those values, norms, character that built this nation from extraordinary people like George Washington to and bring that into the present day.
Yeah. I'm an old guy, so I hit the point in life where I had to reflect on what I think and why I think that. And so what I did was I looked at all the things that are my convictions. What are the beliefs? What do I believe and why do I believe them? And I think convictions are beliefs that you've taken, but you've pressure tested them. So they're not just something somebody tells you and you nod and do it. They're the ones which you've done some soul searching on an issue and you say, I've concluded I feel this way about that. Which means that you have to think about those issues. Sometimes you have to do a little study. I went back to philosophy, believe it or not. I actually went back to reading some of the philosophers that I was supposed to have read in high school and college. And I triangulated that. Yeah, I triangulated that with my life experience. And what it did was it allowed me to look at all these different questions about my life and about life in general in a slightly different way and to really force myself. So I think that's what the nation ought to do. I think what we ought to do is take those things that we have questions about. Take those things that in some cases are the issues of what we think are great disagreements and pressure test them. I think we'll find out, as you said, Manu, we're not as far apart as we think we are. And when we actually study them, think about them, and talk about them, we reach a different place. And as a person, it made me reach a different place. I think as a nation, it could help us move towards a different place.
I love it. I wanted to raise it because it's inspired an initiative called America's Debrief, which the 82 leaders will hear about tomorrow, which because the presidents and first ladies speak to the nation with a single voice. Across every single president and first lady, we're going to draw on 3 lessons from the president, 1 from the first lady, from presidential historians, and to illuminate what were decisions, like Lincoln's blind memorandum when he thought he was going to lose re-election because he was more concerned about union than his own personal advantage. What are those moments that kind of informed us, pushed us toward a more perfect union? Our time is running a little short, so I want to give each of these extraordinary panelists an opportunity to offer any final thoughts about either their democracy goal or other ideas that are so vital to a more perfect union as we move very catalytically, we hope, toward the 250th. And what could be put in place by the 250th that would be enduring, that would help advance your goal? And I'm going to start with you, Dale.
Oh, thanks. Well, we have several goals, and all of you can help. One I named already. We want chapters in every state focused on local news. And come see me. I'm at Dale@pressforward.news. We've got there's lots of different ways to form a chapter. There's no one way. National doesn't come in and tell local what to do. We just help set a table to think through working with outlets, what would work best for you and how to support it. 2 is support your local news source. Find out what that is, if you have one, and support them. I tell people we didn't have to pay for it sometimes in the past because it just existed, and other people paid for it for us. We don't have that luxury anymore. And so if you can, please support it. Support more if you can. Feel free to join Press Forward. We welcome individual donors and staff foundations. We've got quite a range of people in the mix. And lastly, what I'll say is that I tell every time I'm in front of a reporter these days, I tell them thank you for your service, because they have become frontline workers. There's less of them, and the world is worse. It's more polarized, right? It's harder to cover these issues. When people talk about safety and security and they talk about it in international, it's happening here in our country. So if you have a chance to see a reporter, ask them what they're doing. Ask them how they're doing. They need help. They need to take a break. I have people who haven't taken a vacation in 5 years because they're the only reporter left in their town, and they feel such a sense of ownership and responsibility to that town. So we want to support them, but we also want them, unfortunately, to deal with our changing society. You got to do video. You got to do texting. You got to do short. It's not just about investigative anymore. It really is both community side and investigative side, right? And we have lots of examples of places where they're combining all of that, because it turns out, frankly, people don't always just want to see gloom and doom. We really want to see the good stuff, and then we can handle the gloom and doom. But if you also show us the art thing that happened in that community, right? And you used to get the awards only for the investigative work in the past. So how do we help reinvigorate that community? I would say just in general, we're going to have 50 chapters a year from now, and we're going to raise another $500 million with all of your help. Thank you very much.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Dale. And just for clarity, Democracy Goal 5 also includes accountability for social media, and Alex Frazier and Dick Gephardt, extraordinary people, are working and actually moving legislation in the Congress, and also the trouble in national news and some of the misaligned incentives. Zach.
And let me add that the second part of our democracy goal on trusting elections is about a more effective government. And I think Article 1, which gives the United States Congress enormous power and responsibility, must be lifted back up, because the Congress is dysfunctional. It's broken. The 9% we heard about, even my colleagues that served there with me, I feel bad because it's not a good job. It's really tough. And it needs to be elevated again in its importance under the Constitution. And power has consolidated to the leadership of the parties, to a few, and rank and file members have very little power. So we have to change that over the long haul. But now in the next 2 years, before 2026 on elections, we have to go through this cycle and make sure we peacefully transfer power, and hope that the pendulum hits the wall and we can pull things back to the middle where our aspirations as a nation can once again be elevated. I think part of this is we're dumbing ourselves down to the lowest common denominator, and we're letting people that do that intentionally win. And we should overcome that. I am a unicorn in this sense, and I told Jason Carter this 2 weeks ago when I spoke at that event in Ann Arbor. He's Jimmy Carter's grandson, and I said, I voted for your father the first time I could vote, your grandfather. The first time I could vote for president, I voted for Jimmy Carter. And 4 years later, like many Southerners, I voted for Ronald Reagan. And I brought my fraternity brothers from North Carolina to the Victory Party in Washington, D.C. and shook Howard Baker's hand, and I've been a Republican ever since. But the truth is, neither party has an exclusive on integrity. Neither party has an exclusive on ideas. And Doug talked earlier to us about President Washington kind of warning us about where this may go. And a friend of mine, Michael Ware, just wrote a book called The Spirit of Our Politics. And I circled this line and sent it to him and said, thank you. And the line says this: we should belong to a political party because of what we believe. We should not believe because we belong to a political party. And ladies and gentlemen, if our political parties are nothing more than echo chambers for individuals or for nonsense, political parties have served their purpose in the rearview mirror, not in the windshield. And so we must put our country above our political parties if we are to pull this country back together. We can do that between now and 2026, is put our country and our Constitution above our partisan preferences.
Amen. Whenever I get gloomy, I call Zach. Manu.
I'll offer a framing thought as it relates to our democracy goal, and then two very tactical things that I think anybody in the audience can do. Here's the framing thought. It actually comes from one of our young women leaders at the Bridge George Washington chapter. I was just meeting them yesterday. We actually have 4 Bridge USA chapters just in this area, and this young woman at the George Washington chapter, she asked this question, which was, how can I have George Washington especially been struggling with encampments. They've been struggling with the Israel-Palestine conflict. They've been struggling with, where you draw the line. A lot of those questions that I think challenge a lot of different institutions today. And she said, how can I have a conversation with somebody that fundamentally denies my existence? And I raise this question because oftentimes these conversations about bridging divides don't actually get to the core difficult challenges. They Manu, I get this flack a lot. They say, you can wax poetically about, let's get along, have conversations, but, how does this actually work, right? And honestly, I understand that question. And she had this fascinating insight after I tried to ramble my way through an answer, because I still don't have a good answer to that question. She said, I have a thought. She says, what happens if we don't? Let's stop asking that question for a second. Let's answer it with another question. I can't have the conversation with somebody that fundamentally denies who I am. But what happens if I don't? So when we started building and scaling these chapters, we started seeing a very interesting thing happen, Bridge, which is that the culture of fear is propagated not by the majority of people, but by the vocal minority. So what are the 2 tactical things that we can do right now as we leave the space to undermine the vocal minority? The outrage industrial complex, as Amanda talks about on the Washington Post. Step 1 is the ground game. There are hundreds of organizations across the country, in churches, in local community centers, in YMCA programs, in colleges and high schools, that are actively giving people the chance to have these conversations and facilitating them in very productive ways. And here's the kicker: making it fun, making it interesting. We can look those up right now and participate in different ways. The second thing that you can do without even leaving your seat is undermining the incentive structures that propagate outrage. So whenever we go to the Hill and we hear different members of Congress say, well, I believe in this bipartisanship thing, but as I was sharing in the pre-conversation, talking to me about bipartisanship is like talking to a prisoner about escape. I would love to do it, but I can't. And I say, okay, how do we flip that? Let's get very tactical. Say, well, Manu, you and your friends, you guys love the crazy clips. You guys love the clickbaity stories. Let's stop clicking on them. Let's give some of the amazing journalists that Dale's inculcating a chance, a shot. We feed outrage. If you feel like you're part of the silent majority, here's the secret. Don't be silent.
Yeah. Amen.
And I think it's especially relevant at this moment. So thank you again for hosting this conversation. And I personally learned a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you, man. General, any final thought for...
Well, I'm inspired by what everybody says. I've got no clever things, except I'm a believer, you're not going to be surprised, in mandatory voting.
Australia.
I'm with you.
In all seriousness, it would work against those people who get very extreme just to motivate their base to come out and vote. Yeah. And I hope, and I can't prove this, that if everybody had to vote, even people who kind of wouldn't now or don't vote, would think about it a little bit when they go there. They're going to vote, or they're going through the process online or in the mail or whatever to vote. It would cause them to go, well, wait a minute, if I'm voting, I ought to think a bit about this. Yeah. And I think it would help.
Yeah, good for you. I was just in Australia trying to get away from American politics, and everywhere I went, they wanted to talk about American politics. Yeah. Danielle.
Well, thank you again so much for pulling us all together. And for me, the sort of last word is to say it does matter these puzzle pieces fit together. That matters for civic learning too. It keeps us honest as educators, because right now you try to pull kids into our democracy. They look at you and you're like, are you crazy? Yeah. Like, do you really think that this is worth my time to participate in. That is one of the biggest obstacles to success in civic learning. So we, as civic educators, need everybody else on this panel, because a healthy democracy will be ultimately what it takes for our kids to believe us when we tell them democracy is worth your time.
Fantastic. So we're at Mount Vernon, Washington, and Adams. I was reminded by the wonderful, now late historian David McCullough, had a favorite quote from Addison's Cato that we love. And it represents the hopefulness of the panel and the hopefulness in the country, which is we cannot ensure success, but we can deserve it. And over to Doug Bradburn to close us out. Doug, and thank the panel, please.
Yeah, what an incredible panel. Thank you, Bridge. Come on, let's give him another round of applause. Bridge, you stole my line. 'Tis not in mortals to command success, but we can do better. We can deserve it. That's extraordinary. I used to close meetings with my staff. They love to hear that at the close of every meeting. I've been inspired by this crew of heroes here. This is incredible work you're doing. Washington said the sacred fire of liberty is in our hands. In your hands, you're protecting it. There's a little fire. The winds are blowing, and you're surrounding it. You're going to get a lot of support from people here, engaged citizens all, and wonderful patriots all, who put country first, which is what it's about. And thank you so much for your time and being here. And I have gifts. I bring gifts. Looks like I have more gifts than members of the panel here. Maybe I get one. Here we go. So the only requirement is you have to open your gift and show the audience so they can be envious that they don't get the gift. That they can come back and look for the gift in the shops or something like that. So we got it. We figured out democracy and how to do it, right? We're going to educate everybody. We're going to make them get some skin in the game. We're going to make them sit down with people they disagree with occasionally and actually listen for a change. We're going to get them to be good winners and good losers, or bad winners. Yeah, they're going to recognize when they lost, and they're going to be gracious when they win, and they're going to read the local news. It's simple. We figured it out. So,
thank you.
Very good.
You got to.
I got to run. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Oh, so nice.
While we're getting these gifts, I just have to say,
You're the best. You're the best. I love it.
Thank you.
Very good.
I just want to thank Doug again. I met him at a Boeing convening 2 years ago. We sort of hit it off. I came out to Mount Vernon. I've been here 15 times since for meetings every single time, strategic partners. And he's just such a force for good for the country. So anyway, thank you, Doug.
Oh, wow. Beautiful.
let's go eat and drink and be merry and talk some more. Thank you all.